Deep in Nazi-occupied Poland, a group of Allied airmen staged what is still one of the most ambitious prisoner-of-war escapes in history. It was early 1944, and they were held at Stalag Luft 3, a German-run camp designed specifically for those with a history of escape attempts. Even so, the airmen decided to escape anyway, and not just a few of them. The plan was to break out over 200 prisoners in a single night. So they began digging. Not one tunnel, but 3, nicknamed Tom, Dick, and Harry. These were complex engineering projects, complete with electric lighting, ventilation systems made from powdered milk cans, and even a trolley system to transport dirt. To hide the dirt and sand they removed, prisoners stitched special pouches in their trousers and would discreetly scatter the soil around the camp, a method known as the penguin. They also forged documents, crafted civilian clothes out of blankets, and trained each other on how to blend in outside the wire, with accents, mannerisms, and escape routes. By March 24, 1944, Harry was ready. That night, 76 men crawled through the 300-foot-long tunnel and fled into the freezing forest. But then it all fell apart. The 77th man was spotted emerging from the tunnel, which was too close to a guard post, triggering the alarm and halting the escape. A massive manhunt followed. Within weeks, 73 of the 76 escapees were recaptured. Then came the real tragedy. Furious, Hitler ordered 50 of the recaptured men executed by the Gestapo, a war crime in direct violation of international law. In the end, only 3 men made it to safety. Militarily, the operation failed, but as a symbol of resistance, courage, and coordination behind barbed wire, the Great Escape became legendary. Franz von Werra was a German Luftwaffe pilot shot down over England in 1940. Captured by the British, he quickly became known for one thing: he refused to stay put. His first escape occurred on October 7, 1940, from Grisdale Hall POW camp. He was recaptured after several days. Then on December 20, 1940, he made a second escape from Camp No. 13 in Swanwick, Derbyshire, through a tunnel. Disguised as a Dutch pilot, he attempted to steal a British fighter plane, but was caught in the cockpit. Determined to prevent further attempts, British authorities transferred him to a more secure facility, this time across the Atlantic Ocean in Canada. But von Werra wasn't finished. In January 1941, during a prisoner transfer near Ontario, von Werra escaped once again, this time vanishing into the Canadian wilderness in the dead of winter. He crossed the frozen St. Lawrence River into New York State. The U.S. was still neutral at the time, which meant he wasn't entering enemy territory. That neutrality gave him a loophole. The U.S. couldn't simply hand him over to the British without going through diplomatic channels. And since Germany still had embassies and consulates in the U.S., von Werra was able to contact German officials, who quietly helped him leave the country before the British could act. He made his way through South America, then to Spain and Italy, and eventually returned to Germany, where he was welcomed as a hero. They even turned him into a propaganda symbol, showcasing him as a model German officer, resourceful, unbreakable, and loyal to the Reich. His story was widely publicized in state media to boost morale and humiliate the British. Franz von Werra was the only Axis POW to escape Allied captivity and make it back home during World War II. By 1864, Libby Prison in Richmond, Virginia, had earned a brutal reputation. It was a Confederate-run facility for captured Union officers. Prisoners called it Hell for Officers. Conditions inside were abysmal. The prison was overcrowded with over 1,000 men crammed into rooms meant for a few hundred. Sanitation was nearly non-existent. Food rations were meager, and prisoners suffered from disease, lice, and malnutrition. But beneath it all, literally, a group of Union POWs was digging their way out. The escape plan started with Captain Thomas E. Rose, who discovered a crawl space beneath the kitchen, a dark, rat-infested area with a dirt floor. With a small team of trusted officers, he began working in secret underneath the floorboards, chipping away at brick and clay using tableware and scraps of metal. Their only light came from candles made of bacon grease and shirt threads. They timed their digging for moments when routine prison noise, roll calls, meals, or movement on the floors above could help mask the sound. They tunneled for 17 nights and carved out a narrow shaft nearly 50 feet long that led to a nearby warehouse. The tunnel was barely wide enough to crawl through and supported with scrap wood and bricks pulled from the walls. They hid the tunnel entrance under a fireplace grate in the basement. On the night of February 9, 1864, 109 Union officers squeezed through the tunnel and into the streets of Richmond. Some disguised themselves, others just ran. 59 made it back to Union lines. 2 drowned in the James River. The rest were recaptured. The Confederacy was humiliated. Richmond newspapers tried to downplay the story, but Union morale surged. When 3 British POWs decided to dig a tunnel under the noses of their German captors, they knew 2 things. It had to be perfect, and if they were caught, they'd likely lose their lives. It was the Stalag Luft 3, the one we mentioned before that would host the Great Escape just a year later. A big problem was that digging was nearly impossible. The guards watched every inch of open ground. Patrols were constant, and the sandy soil collapsed easily. One mistake could bury you alive. So they built a vaulting horse, the kind you might have seen in gym class. It was hollow, wooden, and just big enough for 2 men and digging tools to fit inside. Every day, prisoners carried the horse out to the same spot in the exercise yard, while others performed gymnastics around it, jumping, stretching, and so on. The men inside opened a trap door, dropped down below, and dug. At the end of the session, they climbed back in, and the horse was carried off as if nothing had happened. Over several months, they extended the tunnel over 100 feet. Then, on October 29, 1943, the escape plan went into action. Eric Williams, Oliver Philpott, and Michael Codner slipped into the tunnel, crawled through the narrow shaft, and emerged in the forest beyond the wire. They made it across Germany using forged documents, took a train to Danzig, and boarded a neutral Swedish ship bound for freedom. All 3 men survived and returned to service. The escape was so precise, so theatrical, that it became the subject of a best-selling memoir and 1950 film, The Wooden Horse. In 1966, during the early years of the Vietnam War, Dieter Dengler, a U.S. Navy pilot, was shot down during a classified mission over Laos. He was captured and handed over to North Vietnamese-aligned guerrillas. From there, he was moved to a makeshift prison camp deep in the jungle, barely more than bamboo cages, surrounded by thick rainforest and armed guards. Dengler wasn't planning to wait for a rescue, so he studied the guards, he memorized their routines, he watched the jungle, and he started planning a way out. But he knew he couldn't escape alone. He teamed up with 6 other prisoners, a mix of Thai, Chinese, and other captured fighters, plus another American named Dwayne Martin. They agreed to coordinate the breakout together, knowing that acting alone would likely mean failure. Then came a turning point. Their guards began preparing bamboo stakes and ropes, signs the prisoners believed meant their lives were about to be abruptly and painfully ended. So they had no choice. The escape had to happen immediately. On June 29, 1966, after about 6 months of captivity, Dengler and his fellow prisoners attacked the guards during a meal. In the chaos, some guards were injured or taken out. The prisoners scattered. Only Dengler and Martin stayed together and quickly made their way out of the prison. They had escaped. But their nightmare was far from over. What followed was a 23-day survival ordeal through one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. Dengler had no shoes, no map, and no food. He survived on snakes, insects, snails, and rainwater. He lost over 60 pounds. His feet were shredded, his body covered in leeches. Eventually, Dengler and Martin were separated during the ordeal, and tragically, Martin did not survive. But Dengler kept going. On the verge of collapse, he was spotted by a U.S. Air Force pilot during a routine search. He was airlifted out, barely alive. Dieter Dengler became one of the very few American POWs to escape captivity in Southeast Asia, and the only one to make it out from a Laotian prison camp alive. At 2 a.m. on August 5, 1944, in the quiet town of Cowra, Australia, guards at a remote POW camp were jolted awake by the sound of sirens, followed by shouting, fire, and shooting. Within minutes, hundreds of Japanese prisoners were charging the wire, wielding makeshift weapons, setting buildings on fire, and overwhelming the guard towers. It was the largest prison breakout ever attempted on Australian soil. By 1944, the town of Cowra in rural New South Wales, Australia, was home to a major POW camp in the Pacific Theatre. The camp held around 4,000 prisoners, mostly Italians and Japanese, guarded by a small unit of the Australian Army. Unlike many camps in Europe and Southeast Asia, Cowra was orderly. Prisoners had barracks, regular meals, and access to work duties. But for many of the Japanese detainees, captivity itself was unbearable. Surrender was considered the ultimate disgrace in Japanese military culture, and being held as a POW was, to them, worse than death. Then word came that the officers and enlisted men would be separated. The response was immediate and violent. On August 5, 1944 at 2 a.m., over 1,000 Japanese POWs launched a coordinated breakout. Armed with homemade weapons, including clubs, knives, and improvised spears made from bedposts and eating utensils, they charged the barbed wire fences in waves, shouting and attacking guard posts. This wasn't a stealth escape, it was a full-scale assault. 4 Australian soldiers lost their lives. The Japanese lost far more. In the chaos, over 200 Japanese prisoners were taken out, many by gunfire, but a large number took their own lives or provoked guards into using lethal force, choosing that over the shame of imprisonment. Over 100 were wounded, and around 359 escaped the wire, but were recaptured over the following days. Not a single civilian was harmed. The Cowra Breakout remains the largest POW escape attempt in the history of the Allied side during World War II. In the early 1550s, Hans Staden, a German gunner from the Holy Roman Empire, was hired for a Portuguese expedition to Brazil in 1549. But the voyage went sideways fast. While serving at a Portuguese fort near São Vicente, he was captured in 1552 by the Tupinambá, an indigenous group living along the Brazilian coast. Held in a Tupinambá village for around 9 months, Staden found himself trapped in a completely alien world, surrounded by a culture he didn't understand and couldn't escape from. He was tied up, closely watched, and regularly reminded that the end of his life was a matter of ritual timing, not a question of it. To the Tupinambá, Staden was the enemy, a foreigner linked to their rivals, the Portuguese. And that made him a candidate for something very specific. They were gonna eat him. But Staden didn't plan on becoming anyone's dinner. So he adapted. He learned the language. He played the role of the holy man. He claimed he had visions, warned of curses, and convinced his captors that he had the power to predict the future. And it worked, or at least it bought him time. Over those long months, Staden carefully built trust, stalled for survival, and waited for an opening. Eventually, it came. A French ship arrived off the coast. Though the French and the Portuguese were rivals, Staden convinced the French captain he was a German captive, not a Portuguese soldier, and that he'd been held prisoner by the Tupinambá. They took him aboard. Staden returned to Europe in 1555 and published his account, True History, an account of cannibal captivity in Brazil. It became widely read, especially in German-speaking regions, for its vivid details. During World War II, over 5 million Soviet soldiers were captured by the Germans. Of those, more than half did not survive their captivity, either through starvation, exhaustion, or execution. Nazi Germany didn't consider Soviet POWs protected under the Geneva Conventions, and their treatment was far harsher than that of Western Allied prisoners. The conditions in camps like Stalag 326 and others were brutal, disease-ridden, overcrowded, and barely supplied. Soviet prisoners were sometimes held in open-air enclosures with no shelter. Mortality rates were staggering, but some escaped. Escape wasn't easy. Most Soviet POWs had no access to maps, no foreign language skills, and little support from local populations. And yet tens of thousands attempted escape. Some dug tunnels, others slipped away during forced labor details, or broke loose from train transports. Many joined partisan units in Belarus, Ukraine, or Poland, continuing to fight behind enemy lines. Others tried to reach Soviet front lines and rejoin the Red Army. But that didn't always work out so well. For Soviet escapees, getting away from the Nazis didn't guarantee survival, because Stalin considered all captured soldiers to be traitors. The official policy was no Soviet soldier should ever allow himself to be taken. Therefore, those who escaped German captivity and returned to Soviet lines were often arrested, interrogated, and sent to gulag camps, accused of collaboration or cowardice. Some were even executed. It's estimated that 150 to 200,000 returned POWs faced these punishments from their own government. The irony is staggering. These men had endured Nazi brutality, risked their lives to escape, and made it back across enemy lines to friendly territory, only to be treated as enemies by the country they fought for. Colditz Castle was a so-called escape-proof POW camp, with steep cliffs on one side, guards on the other, and constant surveillance. But that didn't stop Airey Neave, a British officer captured during the retreat at Calais in 1940. He had already attempted escape from another camp and been sent to Colditz as punishment. But instead of giving up, he started planning his next move. The opportunity came through deception. Neave and his fellow escapee, Dutch officer Anthony Lutjen, forged German uniforms, complete with insignia and documents. The plan was simple, but incredibly risky. Just walk out the front gate, posing as German officers on official business. But it almost didn't happen. With frequent German searches heightening security, Neave and his partner timed their plan for a prisoner theatrical performance. So, on January 5, 1942, they changed into their disguises, walked confidently through the gates, and slipped out into the cold. It worked. They made it to Leipzig, then traveled across Germany with fake papers. From there, they crossed the border into neutral Switzerland. Neave was escorted through Vichy, France to Gibraltar, then sailed to Britain. He became the first British officer to successfully escape from Colditz, a feat that stunned the Germans and boosted Allied morale. After returning, Neave worked for British intelligence, helping coordinate resistance efforts and later assisting with the Nuremberg war crimes trials. Horace Greasley wasn't your typical escape artist. He didn't tunnel out or forge documents. He wasn't trying to reach Switzerland or rejoin Allied lines. What makes his story so unusual and controversial is that he escaped his German POW camp multiple times, claiming over 200 escapes, and kept returning voluntarily. Greasley was a British soldier captured in 1940 during the German advance through France. He was eventually held in a POW camp in Silesia, modern-day Poland. Conditions were harsh but not lethal. Things were regimented but not impossible to outsmart. And so he did. But why? Early in his captivity, he met Rosa Raubach, a German Jewish woman working as a translator for the camp administration. According to his post-war account, the two fell into a romantic and incredibly dangerous relationship. Despite the danger, Greasley couldn't resist and had to meet up with her. So he came up with a solution. According to his memoir, he used gaps in fencing, changes of guard shifts, and knowledge of the terrain to sneak out of the camp at night to meet her. Not once or twice. He claimed to have done it over 200 times during his captivity. Sometimes he brought food and medicine back for his fellow prisoners. Each time he slipped out and returned before roll call the next morning. In 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed, Greasley was marched west by his captors and eventually liberated by Allied forces and sent home. After the war, Greasley never saw Rosa again. He later learned she was pregnant, possibly with his child. After the war, his story was met with skepticism, and in 2008 he published a memoir telling his story, entitled Do the Birds Still Sing in Hell? Before he was Britain's wartime bulldog, he was just a 25-year-old war correspondent, climbing out of a latrine. In 1899, Winston Churchill wasn't a prime minister. He wasn't even in uniform. He was a young journalist, ambitious, aristocratic, and burning to make a name for himself, covering the Second Boer War in South Africa. But Churchill didn't stay behind the lines. He embedded with British troops aboard an armored train near Estcourt, Natal. The Boer commandos ambushed the train and derailed it. Churchill rallied troops under fire, helped clear the tracks, and assisted wounded soldiers. But he was captured in the process. That made him a POW, despite his civilian status. He was taken to the Staats Model School in Pretoria, which the Boers had converted into a POW camp. Most of the prisoners were military officers. Churchill, as a civilian correspondent, could have waited it out, but that wasn't his style. So Churchill teamed up with 2 British officers and spent 3 weeks studying the grounds and crafting a detailed plan. The idea was for all 3 to escape together, using the same gap in the wall near the latrine area. The plan was carefully timed. They would climb over a courtyard wall near the latrine, drop into a blind spot, and then slip past the guards under the cover of night. On the night of December 12, 1899, Churchill made his move. But his companions hesitated. There were Boer guards nearby, and the timing wasn't perfect. The 2 officers decided to delay, but Churchill didn't. He later wrote that he faced a moment of choice: go now, alone, or risk missing the opportunity entirely. He chose to go, climbing the wall, hiding in the shadows, and beginning what would become one of the most famous solo escapes of the war. With no map, no local contacts, and no real supplies, he boarded a train heading east, straight into Boer-held territory. So he jumped off in the dark. Churchill then spent days trekking through the Transvaal countryside, hiding in a mine shaft and surviving on limited provisions. Eventually, he reached the home of a British sympathizer, a coal mine manager, who smuggled him onto a train carrying wool bales bound for Portuguese East Africa, modern-day Mozambique. After a 9-day perilous journey of approximately 300 miles through enemy territory, Winston Churchill crossed into the safety of neutral territory. The British press was already calling him a hero. In fact, it catapulted his political career and helped secure his seat in Parliament. Thanks for watching the video. For another one on Great Escapes, click on the video on your screen now. And if you like this one, please give us a like. It really helps the channel. And let us know in the comments what you thought about these escapes. Brave, daring, senseless? We'd love to hear from you. And subscribe to hear about more videos we have coming out in the future. Thanks again. See you next time.